Welcome to One Man's Trash, the podcast about collecting everything. I'm your host, Levin Parker, and along with my co host,
Hi, I'm Michael Cortese of Noble Spirit.
and we're going to be talking today to a woman who makes her living curating a collection for a brothel. You may know her as the historical harlot on Instagram or YouTube, and I'm really pleased to introduce Emma Markowski as our guest today.
Hi, how are y'all doing?
Great. It's so nice to have you, and I think you do something that is so interesting. So, Emma, why don't you just tell us a little bit about what it is that you do?
So, while I do work at Miss Laura's Brothel Museum, which is the last standing brothel from Fort Smith's Commercial Row, we're based out of Fort Smith, Arkansas, and we are just one of the few remaining brothels that grace the American landscape, but we're a little bit more unique because our eras of operation start from the Victorian and Edwardian periods all the way up to the end of World War II and almost even into the 1950s. But I also work at a military museum as well. And I started out volunteering with them, and I've been helping them organize their collections room. But my focus and area of expertise is really World War II and prostitution, and those two overlap a lot more than I think people realize. But I've also started my own collection of vintage lingerie and clothing, and just different unique things that pertain to both of those subjects.
That's so interesting. And I think that it's fascinating that it's not just a brothel museum, but it's a brothel museum that's attached to a military base and has a specific military connection because I wouldn't expect the US military to be very keen on having that kind of connection with a brothel.
So we have a connection through history, but I just work at two separate entities that just have overlapping history. So the military has a presence here in Fort Smith, but they actually don't have ties to it. We're actually owned by the city, oddly enough. So the city does run, own, and operate a former brothel, and I will be speaking more on a personal capacity here. But it's been really awesome the past couple of months being able to go through the process of looking at what rooms might have looked like back then. The curation process has been very unique because we have a little bit more creative freedom. Interior photos didn't really exist of Miss Laura's at all. We only have exterior photos to go off of what the house might have looked like back then. So we've just been kind of playing it by ear, and our community has been very welcome and opening, especially the historical community, because they've been more than willing to either loan or even donate pieces to expand our collections and just curate the spaces and bedrooms that we have upstairs.
That's really
Oh,
fast.
did your
Go ahead,
sorry.
Mike.
Well, did your interest evolve after working there, or did you kind of seek these positions out?
So I married, okay, so we're gonna have to go back a couple of years. So I'm gonna take y'all back to when I was a child, and then we'll go back to present day. So I grew up with a mother that was a history teacher, and she didn't go to school for history. She actually went to school for fashion merchandising. Didn't really enjoy that, went back and um, got her degree in education. So she primarily has taught the Revolutionary War all the way up to westward expansion and got me into American Girl dolls at a very young age. So I was really fascinated in history, and my first real introduction to World War II history in particular was Molly. And I also got into the Edwardian period and the Revolutionary War period through Felicity, Samantha, Nellie, all of those dolls. So I've
Hmm.
always just had a deep fascination and love for history and collecting because I wound up accumulating a ton of American Girl doll stuff. Um, but as I got older, I started to look at it more from a cosmetology and cosmetics and fashion perspective. So I studied that in my cosmetology courses because you actually have to take the history of cosmetics and cosmetology in order to become a cosmetologist through the Paul Mitchell program. But I actually won the decades contest at my school, and that kind of really started my love for just fashion history in general and makeup. But then I married my husband, and he's active duty military. He's a sergeant and a recruiter right now, but he's on recruiting orders, but he's an infantryman. So we're here in Fort Smith, and when I was looking for jobs, the tour guide position at Miss Laura's was open, so I just applied. I don't really have a formal background in history, but when you spend hours upon hours in archives and just reading and getting a grasp on these time periods and talking to
Hmm.
people who have been studying and researching these time periods for their entire career, because we talk to people who are in their 70s, people who are just starting out, getting their degrees. So it's been kind of interesting so far, but I just really applied for the job and then it kind of segued into the role that I play over here at the military museum.
Oh, wow.
So I'm definitely spread very thinly, but I'm spread between two different places. I like to put more on my plate than I intend to sometimes. And yeah, that could be a little stressful, but it's been fun overall.
So what would you say? Because I'm fascinated to know what is in the collection of a brothel. I mean, aside from the obvious of beds and chairs and things, like what is your favorite oddball item that you have there?
We have a condom case from the 1920s.
Oh, cool.
So I don't have it, obviously, but if you do find yourselves in Fort Smith and want something fun to do, I would definitely recommend popping by and taking a look inside. It was just donated by a gentleman here in town. We have
Wow.
probably some of the nicest antique stores in the country, and everything is fairly reasonably priced, even in Northwest Arkansas, because I'm just a little bit further south of that. And he was just going through one of the junk bins in somebody's booth and happened to pull it out. He knew what it was. It was a Merry Widow condom case. There were three to a tin back in the day. They were reusable. So you
Hmm.
did have to wash them out in between each person. And you had to hang them up to dry like a pair of socks. So kind of disgusting. But it was basically just the precursor to what we have come to know today as disposable condoms. But those were also on the market back then. But we kind of cover what they were used for, why they were being used, and how they were also marketed, because that's something that's very fascinating. You couldn't market birth control in the United States to married couples until 1965. So we touch on that, but that I'd have to say is probably the most unique item that we have because those are few and far between. You don't just find those every single day.
Well, and I think it's
Right.
really interesting how, as time goes on, things that would have previously been verboten to collect. I did a TikTok about it was actually a condom from the 1860s that was sold. It was mailed in a letter, and I want to say it sold like I want to say it's like $1,000 or something. It was a DeYoung condom.
Mhm.
And it's interesting to think that maybe even 30, 40 years ago, you could have never put that in a catalog and been okay with it in a lot of places. And I think it's bringing out a lot of really interesting history the more some of those taboos are struck down.
Absolutely. We've had a very positive reaction from people from all different demographics when they walk in, and we talk about really uncomfortable subjects, but the condom is almost, well, the condom case is really kind of a lighthearted thing that we have in a way, but we also kind of say, hey, there was also a darker part of American history that's attached to this, like not being able to market birth control or birth
Hmm.
control being restricted. But it's also just one of those things that everybody's like, oh my God, there were condoms back in the 1920s. I didn't even know that. So they want to see it and they want to learn all about it. But it's even wilder that it was just here in our community. But like I said, it's pretty easy to find some really obscure things in our antique stores here. So I'm not really surprised that that gentleman was able to just find it. And funnily enough, one of our old volunteers, who was a pastor, was the one who received the donation. And he had to sit and hold it because it was Women's History Month and we were presenting. So it was like an hour long presentation. So he had to sit there for like an hour just with this antique condom case in his hands, which was absolutely hilarious. But he thought that it was really cool that the guy just came in and was able to drop it off for us.
Hmm.
Do you feel like there are things that are still taboo, that are still tough for the museum to kind of talk about in general?
Um, Definitely the ages of some of these ladies. We have house
Mm,
rules. We've done a lot of what my boss has definitely significantly has done a lot of research into what topics we're covering and then also trying to make it as historically accurate as
right.
possible. And one of the studies we used was done by a gentleman named William Sanger, and he went around all over New York City asking ladies in the profession how old they are, uh, what their background is, did they immigrate here, things like that. And he came up with a age bracket of between 16 and 24 years old.
Mm.
So that's probably something that a lot of people do get a little uncomfortable about, but at the end of the day, they know what they're walking into. I haven't had too many
Yeah.
people get really, really uncomfortable. And I always reiterate in the beginning too, if there is something that, maybe you don't want to hear or something, I wouldn't mind just, walking around and like and I'll answer questions or kind of give you a condensed tour. But we're not going to be doing that anymore once we start charging. I know that, but we kind of let people know
Mm.
that the content can be a little explicit, graphic, and dark in a way because it is a part
Yeah.
of American history that's not necessarily the rosiest.
Well, and
Right.
it's really interesting that you are owned by the city, because Arkansas, similar to Wyoming, is a very red area of the country, and I think it's really interesting that the city is monetarily supporting that. And you have Trump in the news recently doing all of this thing where they're restricting all kinds of exhibits and things like that at all kinds of museums for the Smithsonian, and
Yeah.
they're actually talking about shutting down the Women's Museum. Have you experienced anything like that being owned by a municipality where they try to change what you do or influence it in any way?
I unfortunately cannot comment on that at all.
Okay,
I'll
fair
have to
enough.
be somewhat apolitical here,
Yep.
Yeah.
because I get support from, we actually get support from really everybody. We haven't really had too many problems, but I just really
Hmm.
can't comment on
Not a
anything
problem.
political.
Yeah.
Yeah.
What about pushback from public, just people, not any kind of political affiliation, but any kind of comments on videos, or how has
Um,
navigating that been?
Not, we haven't gotten too many negative, like personally on my page, I have
Right.
had people say like very derogatory things where they're like, how much
Yeah.
do you cost? Or X, Y, and Z. And I'm like, okay,
Mhm.
well, one, I'm not acting in that capacity, but two, why would you
Yeah.
ask that?
Yeah.
But more so, people are actually very protective over the history of Miss Laura's. And it's been really awesome to see how our community is just kind of embracing the fact that we're becoming a museum, and they love that.
Hmm.
We have sold out of plenty of events because we host a Radium Girls event every single year now. We're going to make that an annual thing where it's a glow in the dark paint and sip. So we talk about women's labor rights and we
Wow.
allow them to come in and do a glow in the dark paint.
Oh, cool.
Of painting. And then we also have a Christmas soiree. And that was really cool because we had so many different demographics of people come. And we have sultry Saint Nick come down the stairs because Saint Nick is the patron saint of prostitutes, come to find out. So we
Interesting.
tell his story, and we have really, really awesome people that come out for that. We partner with a lot of our museums locally here in the area for it. But the community has been really, really awesome at just embracing the fact that we're becoming a museum, and they love the fact that this history is being preserved. A lot of people here take the history of Fort Smith very seriously, and it's awesome to see that, especially here in Arkansas, because I know up in New Jersey, where I'm from originally, it's very similar to that.
Mm.
It's so fascinating that people have that connection with it because I imagine there's a point in time where Miss Laura's was a local institution of Fort Smith. But I think that especially the area that I do my most research in the West, sex work is such an incredible economic driver to the history of boom towns in the West, and it's a largely untold history. It's very interesting how little of it is mentioned in any of the documentation. And I'm wondering, what do you think as far as let's phrase this properly. What do you think the actual impact is of sex work on communities, and how much do you think it is undersold in history when you read it?
I definitely think that it is undersold and it is not spoken about. And if it is ever addressed whatsoever, you see the depiction of it in Hell on Wheels. I do a
Hmm.
review for movie. I do movie reviews on our social media pages, and I break down the historical accuracy and what these ladies were actually doing rather than what Hollywood is portraying at the time. Because a lot of these madams, they wrote memoirs. There's documentation to back up, financial statements to back it up. So there's a lot of paper trails. It's just that history and the historical research field for this has really unfortunately been dominated by men. And that's not to say that men do not have a place in researching any of this, because they definitely do, because they were the customer base that these ladies would have been appealing to at the time. But having women dig a little bit deeper and realize, like, oh, they funded the local public school and that's why we have one, or they funded the library and that's why we have one. So it's little things like that I've come to realize, that they had very heavy influence on, that I don't think a lot of people really know about.
Mhm.
Mm, yeah, I mean that's incredibly important work to kind of publicize that and make people aware of that. Has there been any of that research that you've dug into that's kind of you felt like might shift some public opinions?
Absolutely. Unfortunately for our madams, we don't have that much of a paper trail for them.
Hmm.
They had to have some form of an education, because in order to run a brothel during that time period, you had to be able to read and do math. So they had to know in some ways how to do all of that, or had some formal education, but none of them wrote a memoir, and there's very limited paper trails when it comes to what these ladies were really truly like as people. There were
Hmm.
oral uh, historical research that was done for an oral history project that was done through our Museum of History, but I haven't had the opportunity to listen to those, and neither has my boss. We are just so busy right now. Um, and a lot of them were saying that Bertha was just well, her second madam. She was a very, very lovely individual, and she took care of her girls, but that was really the gist of it. There was no expansion on if she did any philanthropic things with her money. But I know there's madams out of even Bowling Green in Kentucky is a great example, where definitely when I share her story, it shifts people's opinions. And that's kind of what our goal is, to make people think outside the box a little bit. You know, we see on TV these ladies being portrayed in a particular manner, but what we don't see is, them donating to their local church. One of these madams donated consistently to her congregation. She's one of their biggest donors. We see one madam out of San Francisco, and her name was Sally Stanford. She donated $12.5 million of her
Wow.
estate, almost her entire estate, to guide dogs for the blind when she passed away. And she was the mayor of Sausalito at one
Mm.
point. So it's little things like that. When I share those stories, the younger generation that comes in, so around my age, even all the way up to 40, they're like, wow, that's amazing. I didn't even know that. And the older generation is really like, wow, like I didn't even think of it that way, because I've just been shown this only one-sided view of it.
Hmm.
But a lot of folks who come in are very open-minded individuals, and I haven't really had too many interactions where people have been kind of crass or rude about it. They've just been really surprised at first, which is a really
Yeah,
awesome thing, that a lot more people that come in are starting to be a little bit more open-minded about these things and are trying to just learn a little bit more.
right. Yeah, they're there to learn, and that's great that they're coming in to kind of have their minds opened and then being incredibly surprised or pleasantly surprised when they find out more than they were
Yeah.
looking for, I guess. That's
Well,
terrific.
and I think that that has been, at least in my experience, the thrust of historical content on the
Mm,
social apps is this understanding that history is not monochromatic, and that you can't have that single viewpoint where you have, a prostitute typecast as this is what a prostitute is, rather than viewing them as a full human being. And I think that's what's so amazing about museums like yours, is it lets us understand is that history is not one viewpoint, and that you have the viewpoint of the girls that were working at, or the women that were working at Miss Laura's, overlays exactly the same as with the GI that was there, and the two viewpoints may not agree at all, but that doesn't make either one of them less valid. And I think that it's interesting, because I think that that is the most productive and most watched content that I see across all kinds of social media. I think there's a real hunger for understanding those alternate viewpoints.
Yeah, absolutely. That and so we're going to have a coming to current room that we're in the process of curating right now and doing research on.
Mm.
During the month of January, we actually partnered with our Women's Crisis Center here in the area, and we also partnered with another crisis center that just helps these women kind of get back on their feet a little bit more. They're called Monarch 61. So if anybody is listening and they are in this general area, they are a phenomenal resource, and you can help them in so many different ways, even financially donating or even just going and seeing for yourself, and also just being hands-on with the women is really cool. But we hosted human trafficking seminars for the community, so we talked about the history of it. It was referred to as white slavery at one point in time. So we covered all of that and went all the way up to present day, where we went over what to look for, how to help people, how to intervene if possible. And they're going to be helping us curate one of the spaces upstairs. We're also going to partner with current day sex workers as well and talk to them, get
Wow.
their perspective. So we'll have the two different sides where we have stuff that's legal, and then we have stuff that isn't necessarily obviously legal, and it's human trafficking.
Yeah.
So we're going to explore those two sides, and then we're also potentially going to explore the law enforcement side to this as well.
Yeah.
So we're really excited about that space. We want to make it as meaningful as we possibly can, but that was what we were tasked with doing when we decided to convert to a museum from a
That's
visitor center,
incredible.
not a former
That's
brothel.
really amazing.
Yeah,
Wow,
right.
what an incredible event to put on, and what an incredible thing to be
Yeah.
part of, and to deal with it holistically like that. I think is what has really been lacking from the conversation since I could remember. That's
Absolutely.
so.
Absolutely.
So I have to ask because I've seen all of your content. We've been following each other probably almost. I think you were actually one of my like first 5,000 followers or something to tell you the
Yeah, I think so. I've been following you for a
yeah.
very, very long time.
And you have so many fascinating items at the museum that are just really incredible. And I think it is a ringing endorsement of going to small museums. And I'm thinking of things like you did these V-mail letters that were hand illustrated. And they were absolutely incredible. And it's so interesting that the original has now probably been destroyed, and the only thing left is the actual photographic image of them because that's how V-mail is sent. And I think that's a really interesting way of collecting art.
Well, I'm thankful that the pieces that I know that we have, the granddaughter, her name is Valerie. She actually wrote a book. It is in our gift shop. So if anybody does come, definitely pick it up because there's other scanned copies of the V-mail that I can't put out because I don't have space because he almost sketched everything on every single piece that he sent to his wife.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but we don't have the original copies. His granddaughter does, and she scanned them. And thankfully, her grandmother was smart enough to save all of the copies that she had. So they're somewhere in Ohio in her attic, but um, they're just really, really cool. He was a phenomenal artist and illustrator. He was younger when he was drafted, but definitely one of the older guys out of the unit. He was a part of the 14th Armored Division. They were actually recently just featured in Apple TV's Masters of the Air. They're the gentlemen who liberated John Agan and all of the pilots that were interned at that specific POW camp. But I would definitely recommend come check those out because those are some of my favorite pieces. That you could just tell how much he genuinely loved his wife because he took the time out of his days when I look at the dates on some of them. I'm like, he was in the worst of the worst during this moment, and this was the one thing that was probably really keeping his morale up was knowing that he can send a letter to his wife.
Like
But he
probably
was
just sitting in rubble with a candle lit next to him doing some of those drawings is literally, yeah,
absolutely.
so
Or
amazing.
sitting in a tank. He was a tanker, so he probably was sitting inside of his tank just sketching and illustrating. But he was just, from what I've gathered, he was a really funny man, and it's a shame that he's no longer with us because I would have loved to have the privilege of meeting him. But for years and years now, his granddaughter was actually, and his daughter was saying, well, we really wanted to get it published, but Valerie was trying to get her degree, and he would always say, oh, please publish my work, like put it out there. I want people to see it. And finally she got around to it, and he was gone by that point. But now it lives in our museum, so more people can enjoy it. And now that she's published it, anybody can pick up her book and read it and get to see all the female that's in it.
And I'll have you shoot me some of those images, and we'll pop them up on the screen here
Oh, that's
because they,
terrific.
yeah, it is really really cool stuff.
Absolutely. And I'd be happy to also share because Valerie was kind enough to some of the proceeds from the book actually goes towards our museum. So
Mhm.
I'd be happy to actually send the link to the book as well for anybody who's
Yeah.
interested in it because it's a really, really cool book. And the more people that read it, the more I think Tom Hanks will be more than willing to do a series on our tankers. So let's cross our fingers
Yeah.
that that happens because
And we'll
that's my
put
goal.
links to all the stuff you mentioned in the description when we actually publish it. So we'll get the donation you talked about earlier and get the link to this book and all that in the description of the video.
Okay.
Your personal channel, talking about that, how has the growth of that been? Have you felt like it has kind of adapted over time, or have you really kind of stayed with what your initial intention for the channel been?
I had to shift a little bit and I pivoted in January of 2024 because I started volunteering at the military museum. So I
Hmm.
wanted to share some of the amazing stuff that I was coming across, like finding out that we had some ideas to what was happening to Polish Jews 6 months into the war, and we weren't even involved yet, but it was in the newspapers at the time. So this was public information, even here in this area. Or even finding out that the men of the 16th Armored Division held a prettiest waitress contest, and it was a pinup contest. So they went into town, picked their favorite waitress, and it could have just been like a clerk as well, not even necessarily a waitress. And they wound up having a contest here, and they voted on photos of the ladies. So even sharing things like that, people got a really big kick out of. One of the coolest things that I've featured so far were the wallets that we found in the walls of the barracks while renovating. So
I saw
different
those.
photos, money, um, this ID cards, just seeing how those have
Hmm.
changed over time. Because obviously my ID card and my husband's ID card look vastly different because they have to be scanned now. Little things like that being shown, but then also sharing the link between the two places has also been very well received, and a lot of people didn't even know that there was a link. Um, but it definitely had a little bit of a shift, and I did not expect my page to grow as fast as it did. It's a little bit more niche content. So
Right,
hopefully, once I have to move in a year and a half and find another museum job, I'll be able to kind of stay within that same realm, and I will
right.
try my hardest to. But just having to kind of make that connection and seeing the growth, like I've been recognized out in public here, and I think that's the weirdest thing that has ever
Really?
happened to me. Yes.
That's
I was
incredible.
in like even on a date with my husband, we went to one of the restaurants here in town, and someone who was playing in one of the bands that was playing live came up to me, and he was like, "Oh, you're the historical harlot on TikTok. I follow you." And I was like, "This is the
That's
weirdest
incredible.
That's
interaction
so
I've
cool.
ever had in my entire life. This is so strange." That or one of the ladies at the Savers that's near us, because I love to go vintage shopping, and I
Hmm.
love to thrift. So I went and I bought shoes. She came up to me, and we don't like to use this term at Miss Laura's, but she came up to me and she's like, "Oh, you're the lady that works at the whorehouse downtown." And I was like, "Oh, no, I work at the museum downtown."
Oh my gosh.
Um, but that, and it echoed because Savers
Yeah.
here is in a warehouse.
Mm.
So that all the other old ladies that were around me were like, "Oh, you work where?" It's like, it's a museum, the museum. But it's been very well received and it's been interesting, and even people here in the community love it. And I also try and use my platform for other things, for fundraising or just letting people know about certain events that are happening here in the area, not just my content as well. And I think that's been pretty well received as well.
Mm.
That's
I, and
great.
and I think it's so interesting that a lot of your content is living history content. Is you do the whole nine yards. I mean, I actually I think probably the first makeup tutorial I watched was the one that you did on doing a makeup trying to replicate what it was like for a lady that worked at Miss Laura's. And it's fascinating to hear the history of cosmetics because, again, from a male perspective, I had never considered it. What an integral part of the economy and the community, and what a difference it made for women, and how big of a change it made. And it's interesting how that perspective changes my interpretation of the entire period.
Especially since it was very taboo back in the day, really frowned upon. Sex workers and people in marginalized communities were the ones that were really keeping the tradition of makeup alive up until around the 1920s, when we also see Theda Barrow's Cleopatra comes out. That kind of really also changes the way that we start to view makeup. But even going as back as the Georgian period, people were wearing all sorts of crazy makeup. And then when Queen Victoria took the throne, that all changed because she hated very crazy makeup because that's what she grew up around.
Mhm.
But even seeing the way women have adopted red lipstick,
Mm.
it's a sign of fighting fascism. So we actually sell Victory Red in our gift shop. But I also have the clippings of Elizabeth Arden ads, not just here at the Military Museum, but also at Miss Laura. So people get to see that women were adopting makeup as a sign of protest as well. Like the shade I'm wearing right now is Victory Red, and that would have been worn by a lady who would have been serving in the WAC waves, or even in the other branches. So just trying to make sure that these ladies get remembered, not just the ones that were involved in sex work, but also in the military as well, has been very important to me. Um, but getting the cosmetic side out there is really important as well, because I don't think a lot of people know that the military used to issue makeup, and I think they actually should go back to that because it would probably help out a lot of women try and figure out what the standards need to be met at.
Mhm.
So you mentioned that you also review movies and TV shows for historical accuracy. Can you tell us which has been the most historically accurate and the least historically accurate? I heard,
Oh,
Masters of the Air been praised before for its historical accuracy. What would you say kind of really portrays sex work in the most accurate light as far as movies or TV shows?
so Downton Abbey has a really accurate portrayal of sex work.
Mm.
Really from I think Ethel, she was a maid who wound up having an affair with a British officer because Downton was serving as a military hospital. She wound up getting pregnant and was caught in bed with him, and that was a big no-no. So she was dismissed, fell into sex work. It was a whole thing. But her process of going through trying to get out of the profession, the way she was dressed on the street, everything 100% accurate. And they worked
Hmm.
with historical researchers and historians to ensure that that was accurate. Probably the most inaccurate portrayal has to be Gunsmoke. Anything that portrays singing saloon style, like,
Yeah.
yes, that existed, but not to the extent of like where, you have Miss Kitty coming downstairs and she's all, flamboyant, happy go lucky, which did happen.
Mhm.
Mhm.
But some of the things in that just, I don't know. I don't like the portrayal of a happy hooker. It's a very nuanced type of profession. It's okay to portray all sides of it. And I know that the 70s were a different time period, but that has to be one of the most inaccurate portrayals that I've seen so far. That and easily Hell on Wheels. And I know I'm going to get a lot of flack for that one because they got it right everywhere else except for uh, the sex workers that were in the railroad communities. They're not walking around with their corsets out and they're not walking
Mhm.
around in their bloomers. That's the one thing that gets me going is the fashion because it's basic research. It's not anything complicated. Underwear was crotchless back in the day. So
Yeah.
maybe they're not running around in, their bloomers and doing cartwheels because their whole crotch would be out and that's a problem to begin with, even if you're a sex worker, because that just wasn't
Mhm.
appropriate for back in the day.
Interesting, interesting. I
Yeah.
kind of have to wonder then if a show like or a show like Westworld portraying that
Mm.
was the inaccuracy just as a show, or really trying to appeal to the people visiting, that Westworld set as how they saw it in media at the time.
They probably were just trying to appeal. That's what I've come to
Yeah.
gather is that they don't really do any research into it because
Hmm.
had anybody had done any research, even for the saloon girls, they would have been dressed very nicely still, very
Yeah.
expensive garments. Some of these gowns in the Edwardian period, from what I've gathered, are around $11,000 in today's currency. And
Wow.
some of these houses could have been charging as much as $200. That's around $8,000 today. That's a lot of money. That's not cheap.
Yeah.
So it's just little things like that where I'm like, there are tiers to brothels too, historically. So not every single one's going to be a crib, but
Hmm.
also not every single one of them is going to be what we call a parlor house. There are in-betweens, and that's something that's definitely something that needs to be shared. But there were high-end establishments, like really high-end establishments,
Right.
and then there were ones that weren't as high-end.
I think
Mm.
that's one of the most interesting thing about collecting anything during, I'd say, the 1940s, 1950s, is like the whole attraction of it is it has this gorgeous idealized veneer on all of the advertising, all the design. It's all really clean and really, but even when you're attracted to that, because I mean, there's just great imagery there. The people that are really into it, it seems like the whole goal is to pierce that veneer, is to show, okay, this is what it appeared like, and this is what we were presenting to the world, but this is the actuality behind it. And I think it's really interesting that, in my experience, that's become the narrative of World War II, is here's the difference between what actually was and here's what you see. And I think it's really interesting to see that become so popular when you're talking about, the history world of content these days.
Absolutely. And especially when it comes to like Band of Brothers is a really great series.
Hmm.
Hmm.
But you might be familiar with the scene where they are liberating, I cannot remember the town. I think it's somewhere in the Netherlands. And they were pulling women out of the crowds that were celebrating and went to go and start shaving their heads. And I think Lee probably did the most accurate portrayal of this so far, which is a movie I did a review on. It was about Lee Miller. And there were women that did collaborate with the Nazis. However, quite a few of these women that had their head shaved, because there's no way every single woman that was targeted or attacked
Hmm.
had some malicious intention behind what she was doing, could have been a victim of sexual assault or rape that resulted in a pregnancy. A lot of them were actually waitresses, store clerks, laundresses, people who were just trying to get by, or they were professional sex workers prior to the invasion that had happened. What are you going to do if your clientele changes overnight? You don't really starve because
Yeah.
everybody
Mm.
else is starving. But if you can feed yourself, even if your children, absolutely, 100%. You need a way to eat and you need a way to survive.
Hmm.
A lot of those women did it out of survival, and Dick Winters said it the best. Um, but I think just that one little clip, a lot of people missed the mark on it, and I think it's because they didn't explore the nuance of that more. Now, obviously, the series is not about those women in particular, um, but I think if they explored that just a little bit more, it might have portrayed a little bit more of a compassionate
Hmm.
look that people have. Because some people get really great joy and pleasure out of seeing that, and I'm just like, that's just not
And
okay, in my opinion.
I'm reminded of that scene from Schindler's List where they were pricking their fingers to
Hmm.
bring blood to rosy up their cheeks in order to be more attractive and look more active. But it's interesting because you get that demonization of women talking about that narrative of, they're trapping people, but on the flip side, understanding that this has been a means of survival for women for tens of thousands of years at this point, and to acknowledge that that's part of the existence. I think it's really interesting to see that becoming accepted as part of the way the world actually works.
Absolutely. And I think especially because one of the things that kind of always gets me going is when men will say, oh, well, men get drafted and they get sent to war. And my response is always, well, what happens to women who are in those war zones? Women have been considered the spoils of war for centuries now. And especially when you had the Vikings, the Romans,
Hmm.
even other groups of people as early as probably the Russians in Afghanistan and even the United States military in the first initial invasion of Iraq and Afghanistan. We see, unfortunately, women be the victims of war just as equally as men. And I think that people need to understand that war has no biases towards particularly one group of people when it comes to civilians.
Mhm.
Um, and we see women be attacked, be brutalized. Rape is a very common thing, and it is a war crime, but people obviously don't always abide by the rules of war.
So how do you curate a collection for that? For a history that is hidden, for a history that is shameful, for a history that people are trying to avoid, how do you as a museum go out and find those items?
So the Brothel Museum, we have photos for some stuff, but we actually do a lot of presentations and talks about that particular side to history. I talk about the Chamberlain Con Act on occasion, and it was an act that was passed in 1918. And it was just addressing because these men were getting venereal diseases, but they were getting it from one night stands that they were having. They weren't getting it from professional sex workers. But it turned into where you could only have a brothel within a certain radius of a military base.
Hmm.
But then it turned into, hey, let's arrest women who look like they're soliciting sex off the side of the road, force them to have a health examination. And if they do, then they could be thrown in a lock hospital, former brothel, or penitentiary for reform. But
Hmm.
then it turned into, hey, we're just going to start arresting women who might have changed their jobs, who might have just been walking down the street by themselves, or in a lot of cases for no reason at all. So direct violation of constitutional rights and amendments, but we don't shy away from that side of history.
Mm,
Um, and that ended in around the 1970s in some cases. But we also do talk about the victims of the Holocaust that were forced into sex work because that was something that had occurred. The Nazis trafficked around 34,000 girls and young women
Hmm.
to different brothels inside of concentration camps. Buchenwald had one, I believe Dachau had one, and I know Auschwitz had one, and it was right by the front gate.
Hmm.
So we talk about that. And we show the photos that those collections have, but unfortunately, the best way for us to discuss and talk about those things and share that information with the public is by word of mouth. I
mm,
don't necessarily have to do that here at the military museum, but I do have to cover some really uncomfortable topics that can be a little difficult for people to be around, especially when it comes to the Holocaust and even our German POWs that we had, although they were treated pretty fairly. Um, a lot of those times it's very difficult for folks to kind of process that. Sometimes they need a moment, which is completely understandable.
yeah.
But then they are able to process it at a molecular level, and we move on and we go on to other things that we're discussing or showing inside of our museums.
Hmm.
Mm. Have you ever created a video that you thought might just kind of elicit too many emotions that you decided not to post, or ruffle too many feathers, or has there been anything that after recording the video you say, well, maybe not this one right now?
Um, so as oddly as this sounds, I had the video of me calling out all the anti-Semitic comments that I get
Hmm.
in my
Hmm.
drafts for a hot
Yeah.
minute because I didn't know how it would be perceived
Right.
one way or another. And with everything going on in the world too, anti-Semitism is just not okay, point blank, period. But
Hmm.
people online tend to not really understand that. Oddly enough, I get called slurs on the daily online. And I called out every single anti-Semitic DM comment that I had received by mocking them, and I use humor in a very Mel Brooks type of way to try to combat that. I actually used Springtime for Hitler as the background music for that, just to show how absolutely ridiculous they were being. But that was one where I was really, really hesitant about posting. That and talking about anything revolving around women's history where women were the victims of a situation.
Hmm.
But working where I do, I've had to grow a backbone, and it has to be one of steel because I have to deal with all sorts of different random things
Yeah.
online on the daily when it comes to that. So it's definitely been something that has crossed my mind, but I just risk it, and sometimes I just post it. I can't have fear, and I can't really show fear when it comes to that because I don't want to hide any history that I think needs to be heard and seen by the public.
Well, and
Absolutely.
that's really brave, and I
Yeah.
that's one of the things that has shocked me about content creation is I do some topics that may not, appeal very well to some crowds, and I get very heinous comments on there, and it doesn't surprise me that I get those. What surprised me is they get 1,000 likes.
Hmm.
I
Yeah.
am unfortunately not shocked. I have been called every slur in the book that you can imagine for a Jewish person. And oddly enough, I only ethnically have Ashkenazi through my mother. I never grew up religiously Jewish. And the thing that has been kind of like plaguing me my whole life was like, oh, maybe I am, because people had been mistaking me as Jewish my entire childhood and even into adulthood. And then I got a bunch of anti-Semitic hate comments, and then lo and behold, um, going through my family tree, I did have it in me. So oddly enough, those anti-Semitic comments kind of led me to, you know, an answer that I've been wanting a very long time. Because
Eh,
oddly enough, that which is kind of crazy,
yeah.
but I
That's
just see it all the time on the daily, and I just know that my great grandfathers and great uncles fought fascism back in 1943 all the way to 1945. It is now my turn to carry that torch
Yeah.
hmm.
and to show that Nazism is not okay, and just educate the public on that and also educate children on that. And that has been something that I've taken very great pride in. We have a very strong connection to the Jewish community here in Fort Smith. We had them bless our World War II trench because our grand opening was actually on Holocaust Remembrance Day. So they came in, they did a blessing, and then we also had a priest come in and do a blessing as well. Um, so it was just a great show that the community came together and that, we're in this fight together here in Arkansas and that we don't tolerate bigotry or hatred. And both of my bosses have been phenomenal at creating wonderful ties to different groups in the community just so they're seen and they're heard.
Wow. Well, and I'm terribly sorry that's,
Awful.
an experience that you've had to go through. I mean, that's just incredibly upsetting. But yeah, I mean, carrying the torch, both working and volunteering at these museums, sharing the history and the power behind it, is incredibly important to make sure that we don't, as a mass, repeat these kind of mistakes and hopefully can change some minds and open some, speak to people with
Absolutely.
some open ears.
Absolutely that, and I always do love to rub it into people's faces that are white supremacists that I married a blonde-haired, blue-eyed man. So just little extra salt in the wound there. Um, but it's definitely been interesting because I'd never seen that before until I started
Yeah.
to make online stuff. But then I also get people who are just devout white supremacists in my comments. They'll be like, "Oh, this beautiful blonde woman," and I'm like, "I'm not a real blonde. One, I don't know how you can tell that I'm. You think that I'm naturally this shade because it's not a natural color that people have. But two, surprise, surprise, Uno reverse. No, I don't abide by that. I don't agree with that at all whatsoever. But um, both of my bosses, even my husband and my family, has been very, very supportive, which is awesome. That, and I've created my own
Yeah,
little community of people who are also just trying to combat anti-Semitism online.
absolutely.
Well,
Yeah,
and
absolutely.
and how much of your efforts? I mean, I think your drive there is so amazing, and it's so cool that you're doing that. I wonder how much you feel like your job is to make that historical connection with people, understanding how that history impacts their life, as versus recording history and saving history and getting.
Hmm.
How do you feel like which direction do you pull in, and how do you divide your time between those two things?
Um, I try and do it 50-50. It's been a little bit of a challenge trying to allocate and make sure that I'm giving both sides, equal, just making sure that they're both being taken care of and I'm giving equal attention to both of them. Um, but it's been nice that I've had people who are willing to help out
Mm.
and who are willing to communicate with me. One of the other curators, not curators, creators. I cannot get the words out today. Creators who's in Tulsa. Her name is Under the Blue Sky, and her name is Sophia Thornblad. She is the curator for one of the Jewish art museums that is in the country, but she's based out of Tulsa and works out of their museum. And she's been really helpful at, you know, making sure my information is accurate, correct, and then also how to curate spaces in a meaningful way without turning them into shrines.
Hmm.
Um, but just trying to find people who are in the historical community has been helpful. And even here locally in the area, our Museum of History, even our other just national museums, the National Historic Site that's here, one of our park rangers that's there, he's been helpful as well at teaching us how to make sure to allocate our time and also how to tell the story meaningfully. But we've just been able to do that. And then I've been able to also kind of piggyback off of that and try to take what I've learned and learn how to allocate and separate and also make sure it doesn't bleed into my personal life too.
Yeah.
Because I like to have a life outside of work, and sometimes I will bring work home and then that's not fun for anybody involved.
A quick follow up on that because you touched it real briefly. What is your as a museum? What is your relationship with the local collector community? Because I know that in
Mm.
Casper, like some of the most amazing historical pieces of this area are located locally with private collectors.
Yeah, so we actually have a gentleman. He donated, well, not donated, he put on loan a flag here. Oh, it's amazing. It'll be on display in my Victory in Europe exhibit. That was signed by all of the men of the 90, oh my gosh, I'm going to say the wrong unit, but I believe it was the 96th or 97th. Let me triple check. Um, battalion, well, unit. And hold on, I made a TikTok about it for our Instagram that we have, and it was amazing. Oh, the Second Battalion, the 386th Infantry Regiment of the 97th Infantry Division.
Mhm.
They helped our tankers of the 16th actually liberate Pilsen in the Czech Republic.
Mhm.
And his father was the last living man from this battalion and regiment. So he kept the flag that all of these men had signed. And on the inside of the swastika, it has gentlemen's names that are written in gold. And those
Wow.
names are the men that have fallen in combat. So this flag will be on display. But he has his own awesome personal collection, like stuff that I was just amazed that he was able to find. And he's been donating and loaning stuff to Miss Laura's now. So that's how we made that connection. But he is just right over the bridge in Oklahoma. So he's not that far away. And locally, we've had really awesome connections with the Darby House, which is where General Darby grew up, and that's his house. He created the Army Rangers. So we have a lot of World War II history, but also just getting people in the local community involved has been a lot easier than I think we had anticipated because we didn't know who had what and what was here in this area until we just started to reach out and people were more than willing to donate or loan stuff.
Wow.
That's so cool. And
Wow.
and I would just as a follow-up, what do you think collectors could do to better support museums and what, aside from donating items obviously, but what would you like to see from collectors that you don't see or that you do see that you'd like to see more of?
I actually would encourage people to put their stuff on loan. A lot of people think if you give something to a museum, it's that museum's property entirely and that you'll never get it back. You
Mhm.
can loan stuff. So if you have something cool that you think that the public should see, and maybe you don't necessarily have a following or you're not a content creator and you just love to collect, see if your local museum has any interest in the item per se. So and if they don't, that's fine. Not everything is going to fit a mission of a museum. And that's one thing
Mhm.
also I want people to understand is that no, we don't want your great grandmother's, beautiful china set that she has, but we have 40 of them in storage that won't see the light of day.
Mhm.
So don't take it personally if we can't take it. It's because we don't have the space or we don't have a need for it right now at the moment. So just keep that in mind. But definitely loaning stuff is important because it also helps us with coming up with new ideas for exhibits because if something's on loan, I can't have it out the entire year. I have to find a way to fill that space later on. So
Mhm.
it's just little things like that that I would encourage people to consider.
Very cool.
Terrific.
This
Terrific.
has been a great conversation. You want to
Yeah.
tell everybody the best places to find you? I obviously will link it all down below, but where would you direct people to go see your content because it is stunning.
Well, my TikTok and my Instagram, I'm the historical harlot, that's my handle. Um, but also my YouTube pages. If you could subscribe to it, just in case if TikTok gets banned in the United
Yeah,
States. I know they just did the extension on it again,
I don't
but
trust it either.
um, I don't know what we're doing now. I had a
Hmm.
feeling it wasn't going to get banned again because there's just too much money wrapped into it now at
Hmm.
this point. But outside of that, definitely those to be able to find me at. Instagram is a little bit more tricky for me to post on there because I don't know what's gonna get flagged and what's not. TikTok, I kind of have figured out that algorithm and what's okay and what's not okay.
Yeah, yeah, it's tough doing that for sure.
Absolutely, I have to choose my words very carefully.
Yeah.
Oh.
Well,
Well,
thank you guys. I said, do you have any other questions, Michael? Because that was amazing.
no, I was just going to say you do an absolutely incredible job of taking some incredibly difficult topics and navigating them very well and very accurately and in a light that just is extremely educational, but not too kind of not too dark and making people understand what's important, but at the same time, not bringing the mood down, trying to
Yeah,
make it as
I'm
light as
always the
possible.
girl that ruins the party anyway. Whenever someone's like, "What do you do for a living?" I'm like,
Hmm.
"Buckle your seatbelt," because I got a couple of things that I do. But also, just I've noticed that if you make history really dark and be a Debbie Downer about it all the
Hmm.
time, people aren't going to want to listen to you. So cracking
Right.
jokes every now and then is it's okay in my opinion, but it also makes it easier for people to digest what
Absolutely.
It's a
they're
it's a
reading and
delivery
seeing.
method, just like any other, media. It's necessary in order to kind of, help reach people's interest levels, both, scratch it intellectually and make it a way that can be enjoyed.